Welcome everyone to today's chapter knowledge series, Avoiding Copyright Infringement. Today we are joined by Corey and Dan, who are a part of our communications and marketing team. So I'm going to turn it right over to them to get started today. Thank you, Corey and Dan, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. We think this is a pretty important topic, and as Dan and I prepared, we realized just how in-depth it could be, but we promise we'll keep it to under an hour so you can ask some questions at the end. My name is Corey Kennedy. As Kelly said, I've been with CAI for over 20 years in various capacities, but currently I'm serving as Senior Director of Creative Design and Interim VP for Marketing and Communications. So I work on, I've met many of you, but I work on all of the graphic design, the visualization of things. I partner with Dan and Joni Lucas to produce Common Ground. We work on all of our publications. Anything that comes out of headquarters usually comes across my desk at some point. This is a topic that Dan and I both navigate a lot within our day-to-day jobs. So I think we've had to edit ourselves a little bit to make sure we don't include too much, but I think it's actually a lot that is going to be really useful. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan to give you his little intro.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having us today. And yeah, looking forward to sharing some tips and ideas and background on copyright infringement with you all. I'm the Senior Director of Publishing with CAI. I've been here with CAI since 2007, a couple years fewer than Corey, but we've been working together basically since I started, working on Community Manager Newsletter, and then Common Ground. And now I'm overseeing both of those publications, Community Manager and Common Ground, as well as CI Press, the books, as well as Ungated Blog. So I have a team reporting to me, working on those outlets, and then Corey and I are always in constant communication on those pieces. And yeah, I would say this is, as Corey mentioned, something we work in on a day-to-day basis. However, I would say we are not legal experts on this. But we know enough or more than your average bear about it because we're working on it pretty much daily. So these are kind of just highlights, I would say, on copyright infringement, and there's so much more on it, and certainly experts in the field. Copyright law is immense, and people study it and go into practice it. But hopefully today is informative. Gives you some good ideas for your chapter.
All right, so let's dive in, or I'm going to try to dive in if my computer will respond. There we go. So one of the reasons that this came up is that I know that we've had some incidents lately in a couple of chapters. We're also aware of things that have happened with some other members of the organization where there have been examples of copyright infringement. And so we just wanted to kind of give you all an overview of what that can include, what it can mean, and some different ways to protect yourself against it, honestly. So when we're talking about copyright, we're really looking at intellectual property. And so that refers to anything that is a created work in a tangible form. So it can be paper, electronic, recording, anything that can be seen, read, viewed or heard. Once that work is created, it automatically has copyright protection. It doesn't actually have to be published, which is an important factor. You can write a document on your personal computer and save it there and not share it with anyone, and it will be protected against copyright infringement. You don't need the copyright symbol, so not seeing one doesn't mean that a work is available for use. You've got to have permission from the copyright holder or creator in order to use any intellectual property. So this is just kind of the standard. Infringement happens when a work is used without that permission. And when that happens and a copyright owner is aware of it, they have the right to pursue legal action. And there's several avenues for that. But the bottom line is if their work is used without their permission, then that automatically justifies the legal action. So one thing to keep in mind is that legal actions rarely favor someone in violation of copyright, and they're very expensive to defend. Sometimes you can get off relatively easily with just a fine, and then other times it gets a lot more significant and serious. I actually worked for a design company several years ago before I came to CAI, where there was an instance in one of our partner companies. There was a house illustrator, so, someone that worked for the company who did illustration work, and the marketing team came up with a campaign, and they knew that there was an illustrator out, in the world working, and they really liked her work. But instead of trying to hire her to do their project, they just asked the house illustrator to mimic her style. Well, of course, it became known because it was a very public campaign. And so the original illustrator sued my partner company, and they lost to a significant amount, to the end that, a couple people were fired because of the judgment call, but then a couple of people had to be let go because the damages were such that it was just too expensive to keep everyone. So it can be very, very dramatic. So a couple of more recent famous examples. There's you've probably all, and I'm not showing you these visuals because it would be in violation of the copyrights on them. So you'll just have to Google it later. There is, a lot of you are probably familiar with the Hope poster that was a portrait of then Senator Barack Obama when he was running for president. The campaign liked it so much that it kind of became an unofficial symbol of the campaign. But once it began to get out into the public, the Associated Press said, well, wait, that work is based on our photograph by our staff photographer, Manny Garcia. You owe us compensation for that work. So the artist of the poster, Shepard Fairey, sued the AP in an attempt to say that his work did not harm the original, it only enhanced, and that the new work didn't reduce the value of the original. But needless to say, the issue is settled out of court. And so now when you find those two works, they're typically shown together, and they're always credited to both original artworks. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Other less prominent but very common ways that copyright infringement occurs is people will frequently take works of art from Instagram. It's all out there in the public. You find, this has actually happened to my daughter, who is a 17-year-old artist. People will just decide, I like this photo, I'm going to make it my background photo. Well, that's actually not legal unless you have permission from the artist. Unlicensed images and footage find their way into all kinds of presentations, newsletters, and blog posts. We have seen this at the national level in presentations that have been submitted by speakers. We've seen it. We've been, in the last 2 to 3 years, offering, as part of a paid sponsorship, a video to a lot of our sponsors. And we've actually had, as recently as January, we had one of our sponsors submit a video on behalf of their company that was in clear violation of copyright. And we said, we can't show this. We'll be liable for the fines. And they tried to argue their way out of it and say, no, it's fair use. It's fair use. And we'll talk more about fair use a little bit later. But we wound up consulting with our intellectual property attorney, just because we were like, we want to be sure that we're in the right here. And she said, absolutely not. You may not use this video. They can't show it. So we thought it would be good to give you a heads up on that, because you may have that happen with sponsors or with volunteers as well. Any photo that's been appropriated from an original source and manipulated, this happens all the time on social media. Another thing to keep an eye out for is that there are sites that allow sales of imprinted products. So for example, Redbubble, Society6, Shopify, where if you are an artist, you can have your art imprinted on an object and people can buy it. It's an online marketplace, basically. But they don't have a lot of guidance in place to protect against copyright infringement. So they just sort of take it for granted that if you are the artist, the work you're presenting is your own, and that's not always the case. Okay.
Right. And so thanks, Corey. We've covered a little bit of the basics on copyright law, but what you should know is that it governs the use of any content, an article, an image, a video, a book, music, etc. And as Corey mentioned earlier, that protection is automatic for the content creator. Simply saving that document can make it available for copyright protection. It doesn't have to be published. You don't have to see it on the internet. So be very mindful of that the protection is automatic for the content creator. And under copyright law, individuals who wrongfully misuse content can be liable for infringing upon those works, as well as the company or organization or chapter that publishes that infringed upon work could be held liable. There's also the principle of fair use with copyright. So while content is protected, there are also ways that you can use portions of it, and it's available to the public. Public can use it without permission or payment. Often this is in instances of criticism of that individual work, commenting on it. This is common in news reporting and teaching and research. However, that protection, for fair use isn't automatic. There's typically a 4-part test for fair use. And that generally, I'm just covering these very briefly, they come down to the purpose and character of that use, whether there's value added to that new use, or whether it's for commercial purposes or educational purposes. And one thing you should know is that just because you're using something for an educational purpose doesn't mean you're afforded protection to reuse that content. Another part of the test comes down to the nature of the work, whether it's factual or creative. Creative works are inherently given more copyright protection, whereas factual works have a little bit less, because facts are readily available, or we want them as a public to be readily available. So they're sourced a little more liberally under copyright law. Another part of that test comes down to the amount of the original material you're using and the importance of that work that you're using. And it's kind of a quantity and quality test. So are you using 3/4 of that work? Are you using just a quote of that work? Are you using the heart of it, the main points of it? So be mindful of that. That's your 3rd part of the test. The 4th part under fair use is the effect on the market for the original work. This really comes down to the economic impact. Are you, by reusing something, significantly diminishing the ability of the original creator to earn off of that original artwork or that original article or music? So that's the 4-part test in brief for you.
Yeah, and that 4th one is basically the argument that was used in the Obama poster case, because the artist of the poster tried to say the Associated Press is the Associated Press. It's still going to be, out there and doing what it does without my poster infringing. It's not diminishing the quality of that original work. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through some different types of content. We'll start with images because that's what I deal with most days. And then Dan's going to talk about content, and then we'll hit a couple of other areas. We have a lot of sources that are safe, actually, to source images. And so the number one thing that you can do is source from Media Valet. Our digital asset manager has a range of images that can be safely downloaded and used, and you really don't need additional permission or attribution. Occasionally, you'll see a photo credit. If it is appropriate to use a credit, then please do, but it's not required of anything. We include a lot of event photos. We include member headshots, stock images, and then we even have, in the stock images that I have, and there are ones that I was able to source and not have to worry about licensing. Then there's a collection of lifestyle stock images that we specifically commissioned for the use of the chapters several years ago, and those are completely available for use. So accounts to Media Valet are reserved for chapter staff, but any of the users can share content from within Media Valet by building a lightbox or building a gallery. So if you have a volunteer working on something for you, you can source some imagery and send that to your volunteer, and that way you know that they're getting something that's safe to use. And just a note on the light boxes and web galleries, if you ever would like a little reminder or brush up on how to use those, please reach out to me and I'm happy to walk you through it. Crowdsourcing is another thing that we're actually using at the headquarters level quite a bit, and actually having a lot of fun with it. So with everyone walking around with very powerful cameras in their pockets, vis-a-vis their phones, it really makes it easy for members of your chapter to help you with this process. You all are probably already doing this. Having members take the photos for you automatically gives you things that are safe to use, you know, assuming that they're in compliance and okay with that. One thing that we did with this last annual conference is we created a shared photo album in Photos for any iOS devices, and then we had a shared Google Drive for Android devices, and that just kind of facilitates instantaneous sharing and crowdsourcing. It makes it a little bit easier. People can share the photos as soon as they take them. You can also get people to text you photos and you save them. But it's just kind of a good way to guarantee that the images you have are yours and that you own them. And one of the things to consider here, and we can share some of this language with you, it might be a good idea to consider incorporating some media release language into your registration forms, just along the lines of, I understand that my photograph may be taken and shared on social media or other avenues, and that's okay. You know, basically just to kind of cover you and protect you against that. But I believe that given the more it's just becoming such a common practice, I think people expect it. So licensed work is probably something you're likely to encounter more for bigger things, maybe your magazine, maybe special campaigns. There are several agencies who represent photographers and illustrators who license that work. And there's two main kinds of licenses. Royalty-free licenses are typically just a one-time fee, and they cover just about anything. It's usually unlimited use. The one exception for those pieces is that you may not use those on a wholly new product, especially a new product for sale. So I could not download a graphic and say, well, this is my new logo, and put it on a tote bag and sell that. That's not acceptable under this license. But other than that, it's generally pretty broad. Rights managed work is usually a slightly higher fee, and it has more restrictions. And the work is typically designated pretty clearly when you're looking at them online, but it usually is based on things like how many copies you might use, how many places you're going to use it, how you intend to use the work, how long you intend to use the work, and the license is granted for that very specific use, and you're not allowed to go outside of that parameter. In general, licensing images is a good way to go, because as long as you read the requirements and you pay the appropriate fees and you follow the details, then you're fine, and you keep that license agreement, you're going to be covered. So there are a couple of other options for safe images. Creative Commons is starting to become a lot more popular. It's basically a nonprofit organization that was developed to facilitate more creative work being in the public domain. And so work covered under this arrangement will always be designated. You'll see an icon that indicates that, and then it will have a link that outlines the parameters and requirements associated with that work. So again, as long as you follow what the parameters are, it's fine for use, but that is your responsibility to read carefully and be sure you're staying within those guidelines. And then work in the public domain is another thing. We were just talking about this as everyone was joining the call, but pretty much the public domain is any work that's considered copyright free, things that are older, They typically enter public domain 95 years after they first appeared. So anything created in 1927 or earlier is now available for use. Some of the fun things that Dan was noticing are going to be available soon are things like the original Steamboat Mickey Mouse, the very first iteration of Mickey Mouse, some other things like that. A lot of government agencies also have media libraries that are free to use with attribution. You want to be careful because they are very specific and they can be really good for editorial use. You know, if you're looking for natural disaster images, NOAA is a good source. We were able to source a lot of images after the Champlain Tower South collapse from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Different agencies like that. So it's always worth a look. The Library of Congress is also a good place to look if there's something that you want to use that you feel like might be in the public domain. Those are good sources. Unsafe sources. Google Images is really not the best place to source images. It can be a good place to start, and that's my caveat. Sometimes you can do that just to kind of get a sense for where something actually lives, you know, who owns this, where's the copyright held, but you really need to track it all the way to its original source. Don't just assume that because it turns up in Google Images that it's okay. Sometimes, and I'm seeing this more and more, there are Creative Commons coverages that are on Google Images, so just use it with caution. And then the one thing you want to watch out for are scam sites. These have sprung up a lot in the last few years where just con artists have set up sites to look like a legally licensed, you know, site, and they will take your money, but then what they're giving you is not something they actually own. And so if you know, are to source something from there, you know, you lose your money because they're not going to give it back, and then you're also liable for the copyright infringement because you don't really have that permission to use the image. So one of the things that's kind of a hallmark for these sites is they might have popular characters. You know, if you can find Grogu or the Mandalorian on their site, chances are it's probably not legit. So you should stay away from those. So we will share a document with the recording that has a list of some other good places that you can source, some different links for sourcing images. But those are just a few. All right, so I'm going to take it over to Dan to talk about content.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So you heard Corey talk a lot about images. How about sourcing your content for your chapter newsletter, your chapter website, your blog, whatever it may be? A lot of what I'm talking about here relates back to the fair use tips that we talked about earlier. When you're sourcing content, a lot of it comes down to the use, the transformative use. As we mentioned earlier, are you commenting on the topic or discussing the original? Are you critiquing it? That would be okay. And then again, the creative or informational nature of the original work. As we mentioned, fact-based and informational works receive less protection than creative works. So like a newspaper article, for example, that's fact-based. You can cite that, you can source that more readily, or a research paper from a university that is more readily available for you to use in fair use than, say, a creative work like an image, like a song or a movie. And quoting works. It's okay, but it depends how much you use. You should avoid verbatim, word for word copying. If you're gonna reuse something, ideally you're quoting it or you're synthesizing it and paraphrasing. You're changing things a little bit. You're adapting it. This is something we do regularly for Common Ground, and it's a regular practice in journalism, is to quote things and paraphrase things. If you're familiar with the magazine, we do this most often in the home front section. This is where we cover kind of the news, trends, and ideas happening out in the world that impact community associations. Obviously, we can't cover all the topics everywhere all the time. So we'll scour media coverage and we'll find that source, and we'll quote it. We'll give them credit. We'll say, according to the New York Times or according to the Miami Herald. We'll use that kind of phrasing, giving them credit, giving them that quote. But then we'll also, to give us added protection, we'll also then take it another step by adding our own angle to it. We'll connect with a member in the area. We'll connect with someone if we're talking about Hurricane Ian in Florida, we're going to connect with a CEI member who is on the ground and giving us a quote, giving their personal perspective. So we might, for that article about Hurricane Ian, we might find a source that originated in, let's say, the Miami Herald. We might synthesize some of that coverage because we're not there in person, but then we're going to then find our own angles, find our own people to quote, find our own people to interview. That's one way. That's one way we do it for Common Ground, particularly Homefront, as I mentioned. And this is a common practice. These are those fact-based informational works where it is much more common for you to be okay in fair use to reappropriate things. And again, what you want to do is provide credit to the original work or the original author. However, that's not a blanket protection. Just because you're giving someone credit does not mean you're protected under copyright law. You could still run afoul of it. So you've got to be careful. Those are just a couple highlights on sourcing. Corey, I think you've got the next one for us.
I'm sorry. Went a little. I was going to say I jumped way too fast and it's going.
Oh.
Okay. Forgive me. Let me get just to that missing slide. Here we go.
Oh, no, that's still me. Okay. So yeah, when another factor you'll want to keep in mind is that you will want to protect your content as well. One of the things we do with Common Ground, with Community Manager, is we have an editorial policy. This particularly applies to articles we're soliciting from members, or members come to us with their contributions. They want to share their expertise, their ideas. So with this editorial policy, we require those submissions to be original, accurate, factual, and exclusive to Common Ground, unless we come to terms on that exclusivity right. If they want to repurpose that article that they've submitted in another way, we have to come to terms on that. Our editorial policy also covers that it should be, any of the submissions and anything we publish should be objective. We don't want promotional materials in Common Ground or Community Manager, unless it's a sponsored content, unless they're paying for that position, that placement. And then, of course, the last piece on the editorial policy is that we require things to be open to editing. We have a team of editors who are combing through our submissions and bringing them up to our editorial standards, making sure we're providing our members with the highest level of content that we can, and that it connects with our members. So that's some brief points on editorial policy. One of the other things we do is we have an assignment contract. We use this particularly for our freelance writers. Some of our content comes from professional journalists who freelance for us. And a couple of the benefits of that is a contract like that is it confirms the assignment, it sets a deadline, and it sets expectations. Here's your word count, here's the topic you're covering, and here's your deadline. Here's how much we're going to pay you if it's for a freelance writer. Another thing that contract includes is a copyright clause. We require our freelance writers to assign their copyright for that original work to us. So that protects us as well as the author for any additional repurposing. Sometimes we'll also have an assignment contract for our volunteer contributors as well. We don't use it as frequently, but we always point them to the editorial policy. We make them aware of that we're going to go through these points with you. We've got to make sure that your submission is original, it's accurate, it's exclusive, it's objective, and that we can edit it. Sometimes we will check our submissions. It depends, I would say, the trustworthy factor of the member, how often we're working with them. If it's someone I haven't worked with before, or we haven't worked with before as an organization, or if I'm reading something and it doesn't sound right, I might then check their submission. The service we use is copyscape.com. We can copy and paste their submission from a Word document, put it in the search function of Copyscape, and it's basically going through Google search. It's checking all the terms, it's checking phrases, and it'll come back with a list of results that might hit. And it'll tell you like kind of if things are taken from another source, it'll tell you about how much is taken, like 25%, 15%, etc. So that is a really good service if you want to help protect yourself, you want to help protect the chapter, check your submissions. Another thing you could do with Copyscape is if you've published an article, you might want to see if it's being republished elsewhere. In the past, we've found some instances of Common Ground articles, of CI Press books that have been on other sites, unauthorized uses. They didn't come to us for a reprint permission. They do not source us at CAI. So we've used this service both ways, both Copyscape both ways, as content comes in, and then as content goes out and is published and it's out in the world. We'll use that service to check if anyone else is using that content without permission.
Yeah, one other note on the copyright is that it's kind of the opposite for images. Typically, the copyright is held by the artist or photographer. And when we are commissioning work, if I ask an illustrator to create an illustration for Common Ground, for example, they keep the copyright, but what I'm doing is just licensing the image for use in the magazine, and it's negotiated for that specific use. So if it's going on the cover of Common Ground, that's the only place I have permission to use it. And the artist holds the copyright, and then that gives them the ability to continue to find income off of that piece. They can then later resell it as a stock image in another format. And that's just more common. If I were to purchase the copyright of the image, that actually drives the cost up quite a bit. All right.
All right. And so we've talked a little bit about sourcing your content. Another easy way for you to get content for your newsletters, your website, your blog, whatever you may have, are CI resources and reprint requests. So if you're looking for, if you have a hole to fill in your chapter newsletter, your magazine, come to us. If you have a need of it, you can come to us, ask for Common Ground articles, community manager articles. You can repurpose HOA resources articles, the blogs on Gated or the advocacy blog, as well as Community Association Law Reporter. Maybe there's a case that is relevant to your members and is decided in the courts in your chapter that you want to make sure they're aware of. What we'll require for reprint requests is we have a form for you to fill out. We'll review it, and then if approved, we'll ask you to include a reprinted with permission line. We'll have a copyright symbol on there, and that no changes are made unless they're pre-approved by us. We'll do this pretty frequently for Common Ground articles, particularly the freelance freelancer writer articles. Some of we might need to seek author approval. As I mentioned, those assignment contracts. The articles that are written by a freelance author are quicker for us to turn around because we already have that copyright approval from them. We already own that copyright. However, if we're talking about a member contributed article, we might need to seek their approval. So I would suggest, you budget for about, if you're submitting a reprint request, budget about 2 weeks for it, just to give us a buffer time in case we need to seek approval. As I mentioned, the quickest turnaround articles are usually the Common Ground sneak peek articles. Those are the articles that are available to the public, that we make available in front of the paywall. And then, of course, the HOA resources articles, or those are more readily available at a fair. The ungated articles are more readily available at a fair. We also have the copyright-free newsletter articles. We've heard, we aren't updating those archives anymore, that there are evergreen pieces in there. So if you have a hole in a newsletter or something you need to get out on a blog, check there. It covers a range of basic topics related to community associations, and a lot of them are evergreen. Some of them are now being repurposed for HOA resources. Some of them are now being repurposed for ungated, but we're adding some fresh material if it is outdated. So look at those. You're welcome to use those without requesting a reprint request. As they state, it's copyright free. Go ahead and use them. There's also the CI Research Library. And the research library on the website has some articles that date back to 1978, so almost 50 years old. The archives go way back. So we can help point you in the right direction. There's a wealth of information, a wealth of published material available to you. Just ask, and we're happy to help turn things around for you.
Okay, so a couple of other areas that we just wanted to touch on, just to keep in mind, it is music and movies. So if you're going to play music in any business or public setting, you actually have to have 2 licenses. One covers the public side of that I'm playing music for the public and I have permission to do that. And then the other one covers the specific music that you choose. So we recently were looking into this for use at the conference, and I discovered a service called Soundtrack Your Brand, which covers, they call it zones, but it's basically a zone would be a business setting. And they will cover both of those licenses. And what was kind of convenient is they work with Spotify. So you could build a playlist in Spotify and then import it into Soundtrack Your Brand, and then it'll filter out anything that it doesn't have covered under the license. So you play the music actually through Soundtrack Your Brand to make sure that you're covered. So this is kind of important. It's one of those ones where I know we have done it. I've heard it from a number of people, but this is my Spotify channel. Can't I just play it on my speaker? And the answer is no. If you're playing it for a public audience, you're legally not allowed to do that. So that's a good source, and it's very affordable for a monthly license. Movies is another area. A lot of communities do this in the summer where they host a movie night, and they've got to have a license to show a movie, plus they need to be covered to show the specific movie that they're showing. So we've got both of those covered in a little bit more detail in one of our resources that's called Music and Movie Licensing Guidance, and we're going to include that in a list that we send out after this is over. But both of these kind of were hit on with the video that I referenced earlier from our sponsor, because he was using just wholesale chunks of a popular movie. And we were like, that's not okay. And they're altering things. So there's just, those are kind of a different use, but even just playing the music and movies is something you have to be prepared for. All right, so we felt like we needed to touch on AI because it's obviously huge right now, and it's really pretty amazing if you've tested it to see what kind of content it can generate. Chatbot GPT is the one I've played with, but it's pretty incredible. And it's also frightening because it will have many uses for good. It can be a real time saver for certain things, but no doubt it's going to be used for nefarious purposes. And so one thing to keep in mind is that pretty much all of AI generated content is sourced elsewhere or derived from someone else's work. It's happening in content, it's happening on images, it's happening everywhere. So just as an example, it also is being used against copyright protection enforcement, because there's a tool called forensic watermarking that a lot of larger image sources, for example, Getty Images, I'm pretty sure is using this, Associated Press, any large house that has a lot of digital assets, they can actually add an invisible code to their assets so that they'll be traceable. And this is how people get caught so much more easily. It's not that a human needs to comb through the internet and find where their images are turning up. It's that they've got this forensic watermarking that will tell them where the unauthorized uses are. So it's just something to keep in mind. But we know the Copyright Office is already examining copyright and AI generated works. They're kind of in the middle of developing policy, but if you're interested in seeing what they're up to, we put the link in there. So that's pretty much all we have. But in conclusion, we just want to remind you that it is the chapter's responsibility to protect itself by holding your volunteers accountable for all of their images and content, because the chapter is the one that will be held liable for any kind of infringement case. You'll be charged the fees, you'll have to deal with the legal trouble. While the internet has made it far easier to find an appropriate work, it has also made it far easier to get caught by way of forensic watermarking and other things. If you're in doubt, this is a lot of gray area. We know that. So as we work through this, sometimes we have ideas that we say, well, can we do this? I don't know. Can we get by with this? But we feel like if you're in doubt, just rule it out and do something else. Just to be on the safe side. It's just too risky.
Yeah, and I would just add here, Corey, that as she mentioned, there is a lot of gray area. There's no exact formula for fair use of an original material. The U.S. Copyright Office says the endless variety of situations and combinations of circumstances that can arise in particular cases precludes the formulation of exact rules. There are no rules. There are just guidelines for fair use. There are guidelines for copyright. It's unpredictable, but we know there's beauty in the unpredictable. It's the price we pay for free expression. Where would we be without that free expression? What kind of work would we have if we didn't have these freedoms, if we didn't have that ability to have copyright protection? We wouldn't have Mickey Mouse. As Corey mentioned, Mickey Mouse is coming in the public domain, at least the first instance of it next year, January 1. It's a day that is celebrated in some areas of the US, Public Domain Day. And people celebrate all the works that are coming into the public domain. So be careful. As we talked about earlier, we are not, we're just covering the basics of this. We're just scratching the surface for you. We hope you got some tips and ideas out of here. But we're not the experts, right? There are volumes upon volumes of information and research out there, and copyright attorneys if you really needed one. So hopefully you got a couple of good ideas, and can hopefully these ideas help protect the chapter and how it uses images, how it uses video and content in its articles. So I think that's it for us. But I saw some questions in the chat. Let's see. All right, I see Juanita asked, if you have a company taking care of your presentations, publications, how can you know they aren't breaking any of the copyright laws? I would check your agreements with the company, check how they source things. like I mentioned, we have an assignment contract with our freelance writers. You should have a contract with that company, and how that'll help protect you, that'll help protect them. And there should be clauses in those contracts that if they're violating any laws, they're going to be held liable. So there's no, I would say, set rules on it, but you have to have a pretty buttoned up contract with them. And if they're trustworthy, I would say is an important factor. Corey, anything else you'd want to add there?
No, I was going to say, I think it looks like Rachel added basically a note to that effect, that yes, there should be a liability clause in your contract. And I think to that end, anything that you are concerned about, it's probably worth consulting with a copyright lawyer. It is important to note, and I don't want to step on any toes, but not just any lawyer should be handling this. And the reason is because sometimes attorneys who specialize in other areas feel like, well, that's okay, I'm a lawyer, but they can actually be the worst violators of intellectual property law. And so it's real, and because it is so dense, it's just like community association law. You don't want, you know, a real estate, I mean, you don't want, like, I don't know, some other kind of attorney, a tax attorney covering your community association. You want to really focus with someone who covers this all the time, and they're familiar with all the case law, and they know what is and is not appropriate. And I think they would always be a good source for just checking to make sure that your contracts or any of these liability clauses are enforceable, you know, to protect you.
So we did have another question. So during the annual conference, a chapter posted pictures on their page, and then we shared them through our social media page, but did not provide any credit to the person who took them or anything like that. Is that what made that okay? Is it technically because we're under the CAI umbrella? Is there another reason with social media? If you could just give some feedback on that too, Corey or Dan.
Typically, that's just kind of our common practice. I do have a clarifying question. Was the post intact when it was shared? Or was it like that photos were taken out of the post and then reshared? Because that's kind of two different things. So if maybe that's being answered. Interesting. So that shouldn't have happened actually. But one thing I will tell you is that we got a lot of photos given to us directly from CEDs. So it may be that there was a similar photo that wasn't taken out of there, but we'll definitely look into it. And typically what we prefer to do is share directly from your chapter's post so that it's clear this came from California North, this came from the Nevada chapter, it wasn't one of our things. So but yeah, absolutely, no, you should be tagged if that were the case, for sure. So it is more of our common practice to just reshare the post. And so this is probably a result of our shared photos album, is my guess, because we were all getting photos from different people. I got some from Chris Snow, I got some from Vivian Walker, and I threw them into the shared album, and then someone else took a few others. So it's possible we were all kind of sourcing from the same place, but we weren't keeping very good track of it. But no, I think it's a good point. We want to be sure to tag and give appropriate credit, especially for those of you who are very active on social. I don't want to deprive you of the extra coverage. So
thank you, Corey and Dan. Does anyone have any other questions? If you do, feel free to come off mute. After the fact, if you do think of anything else, I'm sure Corey and Dan would be happy to speak more with you around everything. We will be providing this recording and any handouts after this, most likely next week in the weekly email recap. Corey, Dan, thank you so much for today. We know there's a lot of gray area, so thank you for highlighting some of the things that we need to watch out for. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon today. Thank you for joining us.
thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.